Welcome to today's live Ask Me Anything session on the art and science of systems thinking. I am Michael Goldblatt, one of the Polyplex's co-founders, and I am joined today with your host, Laura Ann Edwards, and co-hosts, Rich Williams and Dr. Eric Berlow. For those of you new to Polyplexes, Polyplexes is a platform to host a multidisciplinary, cognitively diverse, community engaged and facilitate discussion and scientific exchange around hard problems. The Polyplexes discussion is an evidence-based conversation intended to accelerate knowledge exposure and thinking. The conversations are intended to focus the discussion through a multidisciplinary lens of what we already know, what we call the evidence, in pursuit of what we might discover, what we call conjectures. While every incubator is special, today's is even more special since it's our second incubator experimenting with live streaming video. And we at Polyplexes truly appreciate both yours and our hosts' willingness to experiment with us. This is software, and while we do not know what will go wrong, we can assume something may have escaped our testing scenarios. So if the inevitable happens, please bear with us. At any time during this incubator, you can pose your questions in the discussion tab of session 3, the art and science of systems thinking. We have a couple of Polyplexes team members who will be carrying questions over to the chat on Zoom. If you are not yet signed up to Polyplexes, you can also pose your questions in the chat function here on Zoom. But we strongly encourage you to sign up so that you have the benefit of the community and the full discussion. And with that, let me hand this over to Laura, Eric, and Rich. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. And I just want to note I have my team Polyplexes shirt on. I'm feeling part of the squad here today. So I'm personally super excited about this session because to me, the essence of an extended conversation around systems thinking, the point of it all, other than just sort of endless rabbit holeness, is sense making, is what do we do with all the inputs, expertise, moving targets, complex challenges, how to make sense of extremely complex frameworks in ways that are other than breaking things into component parts. And so I am absolutely delighted to welcome a team here today, Rich Williams and Eric Berlow, who are scientists and researchers and sense makers. And we're going to talk about the sense making as applied to the concept of ecologies, information ecologies as a model. So guys, can you give like a minute of who you are and what you do so that it's expanded beyond my little Cliff's Note version there?
Sure, I'll
go ahead, Rich.
go first. This is Rich. Who am I? Yeah, I guess, yeah, you could, professionally, I call myself a scientist. These days, I'm a data scientist, so involved in a lot of sort of big data type of problems. But before that, I've been a theoretical ecologist, a physical oceanographer. So yeah, I'm just interested in understanding big, complicated systems that other people might look at and be like, oh, that's too complicated to understand or make sense of. And I know I'm a scientific optimist. I think that we can always make sense out of things if we look at it the right way, or at least certainly make more sense than we currently have out of things. So yeah, my background is definitely pretty theoretical, mathematical, computational. Worked in ecosystems a lot, done a lot of, more recently done work in, some work in social systems, and then, yeah, in the past done more computational things and pure computer science things, developed commercial software. I've been all over the map, just trying to figure out this crazy world we live in.
Wow, which is why you're here. You're here not just because you're brilliant in one area, but because you have learned from and pulled from. So we'll circle back to that in a second. Eric, please give a better synopsis of your fabulous background.
Just briefly, yeah, my background was originally in field ecology and marine ecology and trying to understand ecosystems as communities of interacting parts, like many species all, interact with each other in complex ways. And so I did a lot of work in trying to understand that experimentally, where you remove a species from an ecosystem and you see how everything changes. And through that, I got more into statistics, like analyzing data, statistics kind of things. And then Rich and I collaborated more in the early 2000s, where he had come in to do more computational and theoretical. And we blended this approach of like empirical and statistical and computational modeling to try to better understand complex systems, mostly from an ecological framework. I never ever considered myself a systems person. I kind of stumbled into the systems world by accident because I gave a short talk at TED in 2010, trying to take some of the theory that we'd been developing in ecological systems and just randomly decided to try to apply it to more of a social problem as just like an idea. And then all of a sudden got launched into that whole world of trying to do sense making of complex problems. But we have taken a different approach to most systems theorists and that kind of thing, which is more of a network structure approach to the world. So as part of ecology, Rich and I both got into network theory as it was kind of launched in the late 1990s and early 2000s, of when there was just more and more data available about real world networks, just to map out all the connections between things and understand patterns. And we were started applying that to food webs and ecological networks as well. So that's kind of some of the background to what we've been doing. So yeah, I span field ecology now. I do a lot more work on data science and data science for social impact. And I haven't been really involved in academia for a number of years now.
Well, that perfectly tees up a question from Michael Becker. I'll just read it out so that it's on the recording. Eric, from your website, I see you work with social mission companies, organizations, and philanthropists. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit more about who they are and what impact your work has had on them? Whatever your non-disclosures allow you to.
And Rich has helped me with this too. We've been working on these things together. There's sort of two broad branches of like the kind of work that we've been doing. One is mapping complex problems and trying to sense make from complex problems. The other is mapping the field, like mapping actors, like who's working on what, where. One of the things with social investing or philanthropic investing, which is very, very different than regular old, like, venture capital investing, is that if you're like a venture capitalist, often you just think of your portfolio as a lottery where every investment is independent of the rest. And you're just hoping that one goes big, like one is like the next Facebook or something, and all the rest can fail. But if you're investing in trying to solve a problem in the world, then all problems we're solving can't be solved by any one entity alone. And so you have to invest in a coordinated way where the success of one grantee or investee depends on the success of another one too. And that they all need to be successful in order for your problem to be solved, because the problem needs to be tackled from multiple angles. So we do work, one in trying to help understand, of the many problems that you could tackle, which ones might have the most impact. And then the other would be who's working on what, like where are the gaps, where is it crowded, like are there places there are blind spots, that kind of thing, just to foster collaboration. So those are the two different angles. We've worked with Pierre Midyar's group, the Midyar Network, Democracy Fund, Humanity United, etc., other nonprofits that work on problems of science education and other things. I worked with Intel, worked with Royal Dutch Shell. Actually, some of the impact I saw in that work was that we did work with them in the early 2010s on the complex future of energy, food, and water securities. And in the process, they realized that a price on carbon was a really central issue for their future planning. And they became among the first major oil companies to really actively push for a price on carbon, because it turned out that it would benefit them long term, and they were one of the early signatories to the Paris Climate Accord as part of that. So I feel like that was a good impact.
Yeah, I will say that's a great outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one of my first questions to both of you is, I realize that you don't come from the formal systems thinking category. And again, the whole point of this ongoing series is to expand the Venn diagram of whose best practices and processes and talent pools should be a wider landscape for drawing from, right? The hard-earned interdisciplinary expertise and familiarity that you two have, there shouldn't be 20 years before somebody has access to some of that, right? There should be other entry points, or at least ways of looking at things that are broader. And so that's what I mean when I say, what is the mix of systems, methods, and perspectives that you apply to your work? In other words, how have you added or expanded your process beyond your individual formal training in math and network theory? You know, like as you've done these different things, how has that then just, do you think of it in terms of a toolkit, or do you just sort of intuitively use all of it?
Good question. Rich, do you want, I'll give a little context, and then Rich, I'll let you jump in, but there's a few different approaches that, you know, we've worked in. One is like just simulating complex systems that are, you know, nonlinear and, you know, equilibrium kind of systems. The other is just looking at the structure of systems, like how are things connected, independent of knowing the actual details for the dynamics. And then another is just purely observational, like looking at data that's like the phenomenon of, you know, the output of complex systems, or the, you know, the states of them, to try to see what's predictable, what's not, and what could you change. Rich, I don't know if you want to add on that. I know what you've worked on has really evolved over time, especially just like keeping up with, you know, advances in machine learning and stuff, which are more recent.
Yeah, I mean, to me, formal training doesn't mean very much when you're a few years outside of formal training. I think the most important thing that I learned in formal training was how to learn new things. And I definitely approach problems of, I like to try and figure out what tools are right for the problem, rather than trying to take a tool set and find problems that work on it. And so I'm pretty much I feel like I'm a generalist. It's like I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I know there's somebody out there who knows a lot more about any one thing than I know anything about. But it's the ability to have a pretty good understanding of a lot of different tools and a lot of different techniques, and then figure out which are the right ones to bring into a particular problem that's a really important piece of how I work.
So you come from that mindset, and I would submit that in this era of being rewarded for extreme specialization, that I think many scientists struggle with the time, the bandwidth, the handiness of interdisciplinary conversations, context, forums. There's the intellectual capacity, but it's still a lot of work. And so particularly because funding tends to particularly reward extreme specialization so far. We're trying to change that. But do you have any insights on how folks who are very much, right, you deal with specialists, like those who have a desire to look up out of their silo, how to engage, other than obviously being on here with us?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's always been about forming relationships with other people, and finding people who were, you know, willing / interested in working with me, and finding people who, you know, I have no formal training in biology. I mean, the only biology class I ever took was in 9th grade when we drove the teacher into retirement because we were such a crazy class. And I have the only formal education in anything to do with computers I have was half a semester of Fortran that I took in when I was a freshman in college. And so I work in fields where I don't have any formal qualification. But it's just about, for me, it's always been about just like meeting people and forming working relationships with people, working in areas that I was interested in learning about. And then me bringing something to that area that they were interested in having. A lot of the times that was in biology and ecology, that was my sort of more technical and mathematical skills.
I think you've just summarized why Polyplexus is a important platform for this time, right? Because it moderates or allows the folks who want to go deep in the rabbit hole to have those conversations and to share the evidentiary and conjecture trails of those discussions with a wider group who can cross-pollinate it to whatever they're working on. So
yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about with you talking about going deep in the rabbit hole is that, I mean, I'm clearly deep in the rabbit hole in some areas, but then I have also a pretty broad range of interests, and that was something that I remember being discussed when I was working at Microsoft Research, and I think that people in technical management at the time had a term for it where they would talk about T-shaped people, where people had the T was the top of the T was a broad set of skills, but then the leg of the T was that depth in a particular area, and that the area that you had depth in might change over time. So you might go deep for a few years in an area and then sort of pull up and find another area to go deep in. But that was, rather than just being single-mindedly in one area, was this idea that you had enough breadth so that you could kind of switch which areas you went deep in, but you still went deep. I think it's absolutely vital to go deep.
I love that.
I think there's also like a thing around, and I see this in the private sector a lot. I don't know so much in academia anymore, but it seems like there's a huge emphasis on technical expertise over just critical thinking. And I know that, like, to me, the most powerful, the most impactful academics that I know were not necessarily the most technically proficient. They were the ones who knew how to ask the right question or ask a question nobody thought to answer. Even if sometimes their research was incorrect or they had flaws in it, in the end, they launched a whole field of inquiry because they asked the right question. And so I equated a lot. So in the private sector, let's say like in data science or something, people get hired because they have certain technical skills, but we really suffer from a lack of just like big picture thinking about what's the right problem to solve. And it's a little bit like hiring somebody to be a writer because they're really good at Microsoft Word, like it doesn't make sense. And so I'm often in a position, like, I don't have deep technical training in pretty much anything, actually. But I'm often in the position of helping frame the questions or helping, and then looking for collaborators who could go deep on certain things. So which makes me tool agnostic, because I'm not very good at any of the tools. I just want to find people who I can work with. And Rich has been, like, a really important collaborator that way, because we kind of go back and forth like that.
So a question from, and Matt, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, from Matt Mihalik. How does one define, quote, sense making? And how do you determine if you've achieved some useful measure of sense making?
So could I was just realizing I could just share like a little sequence of slides about a particular approach to sense making that we've been working on. It might just make it more concrete. And let me, and you can just stop me at any point, but maybe I'll just try to share my screen here and see what I can do with desktop too.
think you've been enabled. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so can you see just a black screen?
Yep.
All right, then we're in the right place. So for, like I was saying, my background, and Rich and I met, this is like 20 years ago, was in complex ecosystems, which are kind of icons of complexity, where there's lots of species and they all interact, as Darwin said, in just so many complex ways. And at that time, we were just starting to gather data on what these systems look like and how to make sense of them just visually. And so this is an example of one of those where Rich wrote the software to do this visualization. Another colleague of ours gathered the data. It's a lake ecosystem where every dot, every node, every ball is a species, like a fish or an insect or zooplankton. And the links are who eats whom. So it's just a simple map of who eats whom, which we often think of food webs, but we don't realize that there are incredibly complex maps of how energy flows in nature. And then computationally, the algorithms to sort them in space like that allows you to suddenly see patterns and make sense of them in ways that you couldn't otherwise do. So it was the first time we could see, like, what does nature look like? And then it sparked people gathering data from other systems where we could see from a lake, a rainforest, or a stream, that there's a similarity to their architecture that is, you can see it with the naked eye, but you can also quantify that statistically, that independent of the system, there's certain properties that they all have of these fat bottoms relative to the top, and the way in which they're structured. And the one on the bottom right is one that another colleague of ours compiled, which is a 500 million year old food web from the Burgess Shale, fossil food web, that also has similarities in the structure of like how nature looks to us today. And so the point here is, like, at first you just look at an ecosystem, it makes no sense. I mean, it does, but it's like really all you get is complexity. But then when you kind of put the pieces together and actually compile empirical data from lots of systems, and then use the power of computation and algorithms to find patterns that are invisible to the human brain, you start to see patterns, and then it sparks whole fields of inquiry of, like, is that particular architecture important for these systems to persist? Is it what makes them resilient to, like, disturbances like hurricanes and extinctions and whatever? Like, how are they, does it help them manage risk in a way? And indeed, if you then you dive into modeling these systems and playing around with these structures, you realize that indeed the way in which they're hooked up does have a role in how they function, right? So that's sense making in one sense. Let me give you another example, if I may, or happy to stop and at any point actually, so this is an example of, if we just randomly construct the networks, what do they look like? And you can see for sure that nature is not random, that there's a patterning to it. Like, just with the naked eye, you can see that randomly hooked up complex systems don't look the same way. So that's, related to it. So that's one form of sense making. The other is, like, if you have a big complex problem, like, this is way more conceptual and abstract, but I try to take an ecological approach to things. So if you have a bunch of problems, like, just how can we address climate change or eliminate poverty or end human slavery or whatever, these are all things, that part of the challenge is making sense of them. Like, we understand the problem, but then it's just a big issue. And the challenge is that these problems are bigger than any one person, that they're made of lots of little problems. That's where the sense making happens. And that those problems are interconnected, so people get overwhelmed. And the real sense making is really around, like, of all these, like, interacting problems, like around climate change, that are root causes, et cetera. Are there some tractable problems that, if solved, could really have a big impact, right? So that's sort of a form of sense making, is like, where are the solvable problems that, if solved, could have the biggest primary and secondary impacts on the whole system? I'll stop there for now, but there is, our approach to that is around, like in nature, we talk about keystone species that have a disproportionate impact on the entire community. That's what we've discovered in natural ecosystems, that there's some systems where one species, if it's removed, or a couple species, like a lot unravels and a lot of other species go extinct. And so conceptually, we've taken an approach to trying to think about how do you identify a keystone problem in a system that is solvable, but if solved, solves many. And I can give you an example of that later, but for now, I'll just stop sharing just to go back to it, not to dominate the discussion.
No, it's great. It's exactly what we look for. Go ahead, Rich.
I think one of the interesting things about what Eric was just talking about is, to me, is almost like a contrast. It's a contrast to something that you said in the opening, which was where you were talking about systems, and if you said something about how do we understand them without taking them apart. But I think that a lot of the time, actually, what we end up doing is we do take them apart, but that the critical part is that we also put them back together.
Right.
And so I think we create understanding both by breaking things apart into subcomponents, but also understanding the relationships and the interactions between those subcomponents to understand the emergent behavior at the whole system scale. And part of that is definitely a thinking that is hierarchical, multi-scale. And for example, in the work in ecosystems, my idea of a component might be an individual organism, but if you're an organism biologist, then that's your system. And so there are all these questions of scale and decomposition and recomposition that you address when you're approaching these kinds of problems.
Right. Yeah, I think the key thing there to me is that what makes this so complex is not the parts, it's the relationships, it's the connections between things and the interdependencies. Yeah. And so a lot of our work has been this idea that, what John Muir said, like if you, when you pull something, you realize it's hitched to everything else in the universe, like this idea that everything is connected. And I feel like that's done a big disservice to the idea of systems change, because it implies that everything is connected and therefore it's overwhelming. And in every system for which we have empirical data on how things are connected, things are never connected randomly. Everything isn't equally connected. Things are not randomly connected. And how things are connected is information. And that's the information for sense making of like, what are the patterns of those connections and what are those relationships? So that's kind of been a key thing for me, is it always simplifies down that it's like those connections are not random. There's always a patterning to them. And that patterning is information.
Are humans not adding randomness to these systems?
No, I don't think so.
Interesting. All right.
No, I mean, they have impacts that are non-random. That
definitely, yeah. I don't think
it's places more than others. The world of what is probable is a small subset of what's possible. There's many possible outcomes of things, but the probable outcomes are much smaller.
Okay. I have so many more questions, but there's some great ones here in the chat, so I'm going to read them out. Let's see, from Alifa Hussein. Dr. Berlow, can you please expand on the two types of mappings that you talked about? That is mapping of the problem versus mapping of the entity interactions. Yeah. Some of the complexity is due to the unknown connections between those two.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Well, let me actually, can I just share my screen and I'll walk through one example like that? It's kind of a good segue to that. So here we go. So you see a blank screen again?
Yep.
All right, good, it's working. I'm going to give you an example of a project that I worked on recently with Rich, and it requires a little bit of background. So actually here, first of all, the context of these keystone problem, I'll just flip through this for a second. Boom, boom. Okay, so about 10 years ago, Obama gave the State of the Union address where he was trying to address the challenge of science education in America. And he made this call to recruit 100,000 high quality science, technology, education, math, STEM teachers over 10 years. And it was a bold thing, like we need 100,000 new, high quality STEM teachers in K through 12 education. And a friend of mine started a nonprofit to tackle that. And she called it exactly that, 100K in 10, 100,000 STEM teachers in 10 years. And that was their goal. So they made a really, really clear goal. And so they did this thing where they defined the problem. They were like, look, the key question is, why is it so hard to get and retain really high quality STEM teachers in K through 12 education? And they went out and they did this thing breaking down the problem using like that Toyota 5 Whys approach, where you just say like, well, why till they didn't get any new things, with like dozens of workshops with 1,000 stakeholders. And they broke the problem down into like all of these little problems. And those included things like, whether, STEM teacher salaries or loan forgiveness for STEM students that become teachers in schools, or career ladders for STEM, all these different things. So they outlined all these root causes, and they spanned a few broad categories around teaching prestige or preparation, or the perceived value of science, technology, and engineering, or professional growth opportunities, et cetera. So then they had this problem of which, way too many problems to solve and which ones to prioritize. So when we wanted to know what are the relationships between these things, because that's what makes the system complex. And so here's about, I think it was about 80 different problems, and that's a lot of pairwise combinations. So we developed a survey approach that asked people to vote on, like, if one problem is solved, is another one solved too? So if you take any pair of problems, like loan forgiveness for STEM students that go on to become STEM teachers, or the number of families that encourage STEM teaching careers, if you solve one, does it solve another? And so this was a survey approach where we just, for thousands of possible combinations, we just ask people randomly, if A gets better, if A is solved, does it also solve B? Yes or no, kind of a thing. And we got we got input from over 750 experts and had over 32,000 votes on these relationships. So again, we're not asking people, what do you think is the most important problem to solve? We ask people, what is your understanding of causality? And from that, we built this problem network with over 1,000 links, where every dot again is a little problem, and every link is somebody's is consensus perception of, like, if this is solved, that's solved too. Then that's kind of a hairball. So then, but it's information, right? It looks random, but it's not. So we sort it so that we try to look at on the x-axis is leverage, is the ratio of outgoing links to incoming links, so to speak, and the y-axis is reach. So in 2 hops, 2 degrees, how much of the network do you reach? So that problems in the upper right have few incoming constraints on them, like few incoming links. But if solved, they solve many others. And then in 2 degrees, they reach, like in this case, 60, almost 70% of the entire network in 2 hops. So these are like high leverage problems. Now, one of the things that we knew, as you just said, is that there's errors in these links. So people maybe misunderstood, or they didn't see something. We noticed that people tended to overcount relationships and undercount them. So then we said, well, what if we just randomly, we assume there's like 20% of these are incorrect, randomly remove them, recompute everything, and then do that 1,000 times and see how often we get the same results. So in this bottom axis, it's like the fraction of 1,000 trials that it was in the top, X%, highest leverage nodes, et cetera. And so from that, we identify in the upper right corner these keystone problems that are solvable, but if solved, or simple to solve, but if solved, solve many. And then, identify those important ones. And these are also high leverage ones. Then we also use some computational methods to let them self-organize into clusters of problems that are more causally intertwined with one another than they are with the rest of the network. And so we identified like this problem landscape. And these big red and yellow ones are in each kind of theme of this problem cluster, which ones are potentially the most important to tackle that would solve many others. So that's sort of sense making on the problem of like, if we could only solve a few things or a subset of things, what could we really solve? What would be really worth spending our time on right now? Then we mapped the actors, like they had maybe 300 different stakeholders in this problem. And we mapped who's working on what problem. And so now I'm going to resize all of these problems by how many organizations were working on them. And so you can see that there's the big ones are where more of the people are spending their time. And the little red ones are gaps where there's like a really important adjacent problem that they could be solving that could really have an impact. So we sort of identified the gaps this way of mapping the actors on top of the problems. And then what this organization at 100K intended was then they mobilized the network to say, look, here's some problems adjacent to you that if you could spend time on it or take your approaches and tackle this one too, we think it could have a big impact. And what happened since then was that they did it, and they were, so it's been almost 10 years. 2021 is like the end of this 10-year mission. They've exceeded their goal, and they attributed a lot to this approach. And they've been so successful that the organization is being sunsetted because they met their goal. And I don't know of any nonprofit that I've ever encountered that has sunsetted themselves because they met their goal. So that's kind of, this is just an example of what we're doing. So this approach, like I said, it came out of some of the theories, some of the papers that I sent were inspirations for that. We haven't actually tested it in a rigorous way, like if we just simulate lots of systems and we apply this approach and we see if it worked, et cetera. So if anybody has ideas or new references that might be relevant to this to point us to would be really, really helpful. But this is kind of an approach that we've taken to mapping the problem, mapping the actors on top of the problem, and then trying to identify gaps and mobilize effort onto what we think might be the problems that matter most, that are not necessarily the most important, but solvable, but if solved, solve the most other things.
I don't know if you two have had a chance yet to start your own polyplexus profiles, but if you do so, and you do it fairly soon, you can actively, folks can follow up beyond this conversation this morning in a discussion thread, but it also puts you into the wider system where you can post to several thousand people around the world in this community research challenges or call for collaboration or follow up. So just know that's some of the richness of this fabric. So let me just read a couple more of these other really great questions in the thing. So there's a longer question from Christopher Rabzak. How could we visualize the Earth's mass changes over real time? It says, new paper evidence makes us question our thoughts and models of planetary bodies with man-made versus nature-made. He's got a link here that I'm not clicking, but would the distribution matter? Does that tease out anything you can answer without following the link right this minute? I think he's saying, what if we transport, think of helium as a finite resource moving out of Earth's gravity field, 1% of the Earth's mass, would our orbit change? And then what?
Well, that's an interesting question.
No, it is an interesting question. Well, again, right, it's a legitimate question about asteroids and the moon. If we start mining the crap out of them, what happens when we change their trajectories? It's possible.
I don't know. I don't know if I totally understand the question, to be honest.
It's okay. It's all right. Let's see.
I would add that there's this initiative that I've just recently been involved in where the former president of National Geographic, Tim Kelly, is directing this thing with the Global Commons Alliance, where they're building a dashboard for planet Earth, trying to, like, in real time, like, just show the public changes in what's happening. The thing that is, I think, really difficult about a dashboard for planet Earth is it's so many of the changes that matter are happening like slowly and incrementally. But the outcomes that matter are nonlinear and dramatic, you know what I mean? So it's this thing where like these slow, gradual changes like temperature changing or whatever are, they're not that exciting to track. It's not like tracking the results of the election in real time or something, you know? And yet, because it's a complex system, there are this possibility that a small incremental change suddenly leads to like really dramatic outcomes. So that's what interests me is like the dramatic responses to like a gradual forcing.
Yeah, and also that what is a small change when it's averaged out across the whole of the planet is actually a consequence of extreme events happening.
Right.
And so, you know, we don't see 1 degree Celsius temperature rise. What we see is, you know, increased deadly heat waves and, you know, agriculture affecting heat waves and things like that.
Right.
And so what we, when you average it all out, it doesn't sound very dramatic, but actually things are the things that are happening that matter are happening much more on a local and regional scale rather than a planetary scale.
Right. Which I think that would be really neat to map. Like I would love to see a map of the world where extreme events are happening, like just little hotspots of
Right.
extreme drought, extreme, you know, temperature, extreme precipitation. Yeah.
We're starting to see some of that on the NASA climate wall and the NVIDIA quantum computing climate center, of at least having a space to step into 2D or surround of real data in real time, and turning things on and off, you know, being in the center of the global storm system or, you know, things like that, which are hold, I think, great promise. So that's a good tip off too. I wanted to ask you guys, were visualizations always a part of your work? I mean, is the sense making, I'm a big advocate of spatial thinking and visuals just for me to wrap my mind around it, to have another way to reinforce an abstract concept. But was it always part of your work? And if not, what prompted you to pursue it as an avenue towards sense making?
Yeah, I can definitely say that for me, visualizations were very much always part of my work. Some of the earliest visualizations that I did and that are published were done by printing out some color data visualizations. This was done probably around in the early 1980s, printing them out. It was fluid dynamics, it was ocean current measurements, and I co-opted the satellite oceanography computing facility at Scripps, where I was a grad student, to print out some non-satellite data. And then I took an X-Acto knife and cut out these little strips. And then I printed a current flow track in 2D and glued it onto some foam core and used an X-Acto knife to cut a slot along where the current was and take these photographs and basically stand them up in this slot that I'd cut in order to build basically like a 3D visualization of the temperature field in the deep ocean. And then use my camera to take a photograph of it, and that's what got published.
It's making my little heart pitter patter.
So yes, I've always visualized things. I think very spatially, I think, and it just really helped for me to understand what was going on.
Right.
And,
yeah, I think for me, when in the mid 90s, I discovered this very simple interactive statistical discovery tool called JUMP, it's made by SAS, JMP. And it was the first time that I was able to just have many plots up and then click on a point and see it highlighted in every other chart and have it be really, or drag and select a bunch and see them highlighted on all the other charts. And it was like turned data analysis into a video game for me, where I was just like addicted to finding, like looking, it's like a treasure hunt. And I still use it today. And it's like at some point, it's this idea where it's not just about seeing, but I have to be able to interact with it in a way that you can make a chart or a graph or whatever using code like in Python or R, where you make these pretty graphs. But for me, if there's any friction to doing that, like you gotta write the code for it and think about what you wanted and then have it, like that stuff is good for repeatability. But if I can just have like a really quick question and get a quick answer to it visually, where it's through an interactive interface, it encourages me to ask questions because there's no effort to getting the answer. And that's been like the key to me to like just seeing something weird, seeing an outlier, seeing like identifying errors in the data, seeing a pattern that didn't make sense and asked a new question that I didn't ask before that turned into a Nature paper or whatever it is, like that it was the interactivity of it that was really key for me to do. That said, there's a lot of stuff like with network visualization where I used to think that I wanted to share those visuals with others, but then nobody would get them. So I've kind of realized that then when you're presenting to others, you need to flatten it and just present a summary that tells a story. But for my own work, being able to see it in many different ways has been really critical to creative ideation. And yeah, I can't stand trying to make charts through scripts. Like I have to have like an interface doing it because it's like because otherwise if there's a little bit of effort to do it, I don't want to do it.
And so can folks who don't have a Rich in their lives to write more complex scripts, how hard a learning curve are we talking about if that's not your specialty?
Well, I mean, I use there's plenty of tools out there. Like I use JMP. I use something that Rich helped build. That we had a company that built this interactive network visualization tool that I was part of what I just showed you. And I have learned a little bit of enough scripting to make repeatable simple charts if I want to, but I just never go to it because I want to just quickly interact with things. And now there's there's Tableau and other things like that. There's a lot of exploratory data analysis tools out there that I think get poo-pooed by hardcore scientists because, like, again, you have to do it in code if it's repeatable, etc. But I think for casual exploration, any kind of visual interactive interface for data is really, really valuable for creative thinking.
So tell us a little bit more about Mapper and Vibrant Data. So in terms of why, like you say, how it evolved to address things you were trying to make sense of.
It's a good question.
And what's open source and what's not, and how do people?
Yeah. If you go to here, I'll just type in here openmapper.org. I'll type in the chat. Is where I kind of there's links to the code there, stuff that we did, and some examples. Well, Rich had when I first met Rich, he created this 3D software for visualizing food webs, and I just really fell in love with it and used it for the first talk I gave at TED in 2010, and then after that, I got so many inquiries about the software, like what do you use and all that stuff. And there were two other TED fellows, an artist and a computer scientist, that got really interested in trying to just build a company that would create an easier access kind of interactive network visualization software. We hired Rich, of course, to help lead that, and tried to create this simple thing that worked in the browser that you could create interactive networks that you could poke around and explore. I still think it's the most beautiful network visualization that I've seen of all the other available open source tools around. But then I discovered that it's really a challenge to like have other people use it, because it's a lot of work to make a product that works seamlessly. And so we ended up getting acquired before we actually really finished it. And since then, we simplified it and made an open source version of it that if you already have like a network data, that you can convert it into the format and upload it and run this thing. So that's what's available on that page. But I realized that this thing in academia was where you can get funding in academia because something is interesting or impactful in the world. And this network visualization tool that we built, every time we showed it to an investor, they'd be like, wow, that's beautiful. That's super cool. Who's going to buy it? And why are they going to buy it? And I couldn't have an answer for it because it was for exploration, for discovering things you didn't think of before, for asking questions you didn't think to ask. And I couldn't say like, oh, this is going to give you an answer that's going to make you X amount of money, or it's going to save you this amount of money. And so we really, really struggled with like selling it because it's going to make you more money than you spent on it. I could sell it to you because it's just cool and it's interesting. But I am using it now a little bit in other work, like with Pierre Midyar and trying to map actors in the philanthropy space and that kind of stuff. But again, there is this thing around often, and Kumu has the same issue too. It's also like an interactive system visualization tool that it seems like a great idea to just to give people this interactive network to play with, and yet then people get overwhelmed and they don't know what to do with it. So, so I've struggled with that. It's like really beautiful, and then you're like, what do I do?
And Vibrant Data is what?
Vibrant Data was the company we created to make Mapper. Okay. And then we were acquired before we really finished Mapper. We were acquired by Rakuten, which is this giant e-commerce company, like the Amazon of Japan. And it seems really weird, but we're working on e-commerce data there. But the idea is like, if all the visualization tools and algorithms for understanding patterns in who eats whom in an ecosystem, like a food web, readily applies to who buys what in an economy. So all that data, transaction data, is just like a bigger scale version of a food web. And then we were doing a lot of work and just looking at patterns in the consumer landscape. And it was probably like the worst couple of years of my life working in e-commerce. Rich can attest to it. It was really depressing. We felt like even though our company was acquired and in theory it was a successful venture, I just felt like we totally failed. Like all of our creative energy that went into trying to make visualization of complex systems more accessible to people so that they could think holistically. Suddenly all our creative talent on the team is being applied to like, market research and hedge funds and targeted advertising on Facebook. And it was awful. Yeah. It was just the worst thing ever.
On the other hand, it did give you the space to actually, sit down with me and learn some Python.
Yeah, so then that's where I learned Python, and now I'm so into it. I'm having so much fun doing data science afterwards. And it didn't teach me a lot about that world, about big data, about how bad big data is, and how, in other words, like how poor quality it is, and how a lot of the claims about what it can do are just really wrong. And Rich and I were just talking about this earlier, that a lot of the sense-making things around, complex systems and problems, many people assume that, oh, the data is just out there and you can just do, it's just big data everywhere. And yet, and so we should be able to understand these systems more. The data sucks, and it's really focused on like just transaction data, who bought what or who clicked where. But the real data that we need is not available. It's not easily available.
So I have an AI question, or open up the topic of AI. When will AI be a true sense-making partner in this cycle of not just analysis and summary statements, but of critical thinking?
I think in many ways it's well, it's an interesting question, because you asked when will it be a partner, and that's a very different question than when will it be sense making.
Okay,
I think it's already a partner,
right?
But that I think it's really far away from doing any sense making on its own.
Right.
And I think that there's so much of AI to me is just blind pattern discovery. And so it's so dependent on the human for interpretation.
Right.
But the process that Eric described of wanting rapid iteration to spark new areas of critical thinking, is that not something that if we started to make that a best practice, that the AIs that people like you train can get smarter at this, at least some framework of that critical thinking prompting faster?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think that part of critical thinking and creativity has to do with, with coming up with something. What does it mean to come up with something that we don't know yet? And there's so much of what goes on with AI is just, I mean, it's basically like large scale applied computational statistics. And so I mean, when you take a machine learning class, the first problem that you see to get the idea of what machine learning is, generally the first thing they do is just frame a linear regression model in the language of machine learning. And by doing that, you can really begin to understand sort of some of the limitations of it too, because this is one of the really sort of simple examples I like to think about is, suppose you've got a tub of water and a thermometer in it, and you take data, you're heating it up at a constant rate, and you take data and you get this nice straight line, right?
Yep.
So then you can build a model, linear regression model, goes through those points, great. So then you can use that to make predictions, great, no problem. So you've got temperature versus time, and you can predict temperature at any time. So let's go very far into the future. That model is going to tell you that your water is really, really hot. And it's not, because that's a regression model. You can't extrapolate. You can only interpolate and trust it.
Right.
And to me, that's a really fundamental part of when you're just dealing with data without any process-based modeling, without any physical, biological, sociological understanding that's constraining the model, then you run into those issues.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also note that, and this is actually something we bumped into when we were doing Vibrant Data at the time. It was like, what was it, 2013, 14? There was like so much like excitement about AI to like automate insights. And we were trying to build something that was for discovery, for just like to explore data and look at it. And everybody just wanted answers, not, tools to ask better questions. And of course, since then, we discovered that AI often gives us, unintentional bias and answers that, are kind of like Rich was saying, predicting that water temperature will grow infinitely, without leveling off. And so I think the thing to remember is that there's a class of artificial intelligence which is just focused on predictions without understanding. So it's explicitly not for increasing your understanding. It's just to make predictions like what insurance rate should we give you? Should we give you a loan? Are you high risk or not? Are you going to click on this ad? Yes or no? Without even caring whether you're clicking on the ad because you're really interested in that thing and you have the resources to pay for it, or because you're just extremely vulnerable and like a compulsive spender. We don't care. All we care is, did you click on it? Yes or no? And so, so there's another like use of machine learning or AI, which is more about being a partner. Like the visualizations that I showed you are where machines are being used to find patterns that you couldn't see with your brain, and then rendering them for you, so then you can notice like an outlying point, or you can notice a cluster of things that's like, oh, these things are all similar to one another. I didn't realize it. So that's where machines are a partner to help show you things that you couldn't see. But that's very different than applying machines to make predictions that you use to make decisions without understanding why that prediction was made. There is this thing, since all that hype around, and awareness around bias in algorithms and AI and ethics in AI has come up, there have been some things like this, just posted in the chat, this what if tool that Google developed, which is like code-free probing of machine learning models. So you can try to see whether or not there's like unintentional bias in the data, in the training data, et cetera. I think things like that are, I think IBM has developed one. I think Microsoft has two. There's been a lot more. And as I mentioned earlier, those are all, it explicitly says code-free probing, which means if it's a visual interface that you just see things, interact with it, and doesn't require a lot of effort to code to get the answer, then you're more likely to just play around and explore. So it's meant to try to encourage you to, to ask questions of the data. But I think as long as engineers are being trained to just increase the efficiency of the answer rather than understand why it gave that answer, then we'll always be kind of screwed.
I'm tiptoeing into a set of projects that are specifically exploring AI human collaboration. Right? What does it mean to calibrate that to the best outcomes? And how can that reach? So a simple example would be, right, if Wikipedia was just the one side without the human editors chiming in, altering, playing, it'd be a very different thing. And so what does that look like? How, you know, what is, I feel like it's just the start of that conversation, but so it's a good time to ask you. So Eric, you brought up things for this research community to think about and to maybe give you some feedback on. Are there any particular things in any of your T-shaped interest areas that you think the research community in general, that were some gaps, things that are questions that are really, you're not seeing being addressed?
Yeah, I still struggle with this question of like, for a complex system, if all you knew was the connections between things and not like you didn't know enough to like model the whole thing, what's the least you need to know to understand the most? Like, could you easily predict which are the control points in the network from just some, you know, error-prone data on what's connected to what? How much can you infer about the dynamics of this system from just the structure alone? There's like this recurring question that I always have that we've explored a bit, but then if I was still in academia and I had like a well-funded lab, that's totally what I would, you know, be bringing postdocs and grad students on to explore. So it's a really big area.
How about you, Rich?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, just you know, I'm involved in a project that's, I would say, more conceptual at the moment than realized, for doing whole system modeling of ecosystems, coupled ecological social systems, using islands as kind of like a model ecosystem, the way people have model organisms in biology. And yeah, it brings up a whole raft of questions to do with collaboration, modeling, modeling of big systems, data use, and a whole lot of almost like research methodology questions, which I'm really interested in, but also a whole lot of methodological modeling methodological questions, which I'm interested in, which some of them are definitely very similar to what Eric is saying, because yeah, these systems are very, very complex. So it's like, where are the points of sensitivity? Where are the things that you need to have accurate models? Because a small change in those models causes a big change in the outcome. And where are the places where you don't really need to put a great deal of effort in? And so that, because you have a finite amount of sort of modeling effort to spend, whether it's computational effort or intellectual, people brain power effort, and And so how do you spend that effort most effectively when you're dealing with trying to produce a particular class of predictions in a very complex system?
Right. Yeah, I think a lot about when you just said, Rich, around climate change modeling, like the early models of climate change decades ago actually were pretty good, you know?
Yeah,
And
they were quite good.
decades of like building these super complex, you know, detailed models of entire climate systems.
To avoid actually doing anything about the problem.
Yeah, that
Or
didn't,
something like that.
you know, and that all along the way, well, that's uncertain, you know, learn no more, we need to know more. And yet it's taken decades to do any action around it. And I keep wondering, like, if early
have we
on,
done any action?
What's that?
I said, have we done any action?
Well, we've done a little bit, but then we've also, like, you know, done the opposite even more. So
yes, the net is clearly not.
I mean, my understanding is that in the early IPCC reports, when they would, you know, have scenarios for the forcings of, like, you know, the CO2 emissions, et cetera, that, you know, they had business as usual, you know, optimistic, a worst case scenario of human forcings. And despite like advances in renewable energy, electric vehicles, whatever, we, you know, the latest report, we've surpassed the worst case scenario of the early ones in terms of not the outcome, but I mean the actual forcings. But I just keep thinking, like, for a lot of these problems, like, there's got to be ways, like, what's the least amount that we need to know to make useful predictions about where to intervene and where to find alignment and where to act.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the, to me, that's one of the hopes of embracing complexity is that you have a system which is a huge number of complex pieces all interacting in very complex ways. But if you step back and put on your fuzzy glasses, or take off your glasses if you're blind like me, that when you step back, there are emergent patterns where you don't actually need to know all of those components in great detail. But there probably are some components which you do need to know better, and other components which you don't need to know so well. And to me, that's one of the really, really interesting questions, is how do you figure out which pieces of the system you need to understand in order to be able to build useful predictions about that system?
Right.
So there's a question in the chat about have either of you, together or separately, been doing any work on COVID data? And if so, what have you found the most interesting? Or have you been tracking the work of, like, in the COVID tracking project and others?
Yeah, Eric and I, early in the days of COVID, Eric, conned me into building a COVID dashboard so you could look at data the way that I like to look at data, which isn't necessarily the way everybody else likes to look at data. So definitely for a few months there, I was digging pretty deeply into the data.
And part of that dashboard too was not like, there's like COVID data, but then there's other data like joblessness reports, unemployment, other social, economic, demographic kinds of things. And so one of the things was, like, we want to see not just patterns of case rates, but we want to see, like, where does that intersect with demographics and manufacturing job distributions and unemployment and education and all that kind of stuff. So we were trying to build this dashboard where you could look at the interaction, the relationships between all these different socioeconomic, demographic causes and consequences of those trends. And it was sort of partially funded, and then we just got overwhelmed by their work and we never finished it. So that was.
But yeah, it was interesting to look at. It was to me kind of just depressing how fragmented the data was, and how little effort there was institutionally to change that. And I know there's been some really good work done by various organizations to pull data together, but the basic data reporting, through public health agencies and up through the CDC, is so, at that time, it was so fragmented. It was just kind of
Right,
sad to see that it was like that.
Yeah, an example of that is one of the most important pieces of information is the positivity rate, like what fraction of tests are positive. And that actually does not universally get reported at the county level. The counties get the number of cases, but they don't get the total number of tests. It's aggregated later at the state level, so there are dashboards that show that. But there is no data county by county across the country for what are the positivity rates. Some counties do it, some kind of don't. You can't get it, so it's really frustrating. And then what's really important is understanding where does COVID outbreaks overlap with other kinds of economic data, like what kinds of jobs are in that area, whether it's like what's the fraction of workers that can't work from home, what are the fraction of parents that are single, that if they can't and they have to go to work and their kids are going to be at home without any help, like those are the things, like how do you map the landscape of socioeconomic consequences that are not just single dimensional COVID numbers. That's kind of what really interests me, and it was hard to get data at a consistent scale to do that, like county by county.
Mm-hmm. So as we look toward it, are you finding, as with your background, that in this COVID interim, that folks are reaching out to you for broader point of view on systems challenges? Is there? I'm hopeful, and maybe I'm just being naive, that as we have the sliding moment of the world's attention around a global pandemic, and I do believe that the window will slam shut, but that there's a little opening for projects infused with this point of view, with a way to say, hey, it's important to build this into, say, rethinking public health, public global health, right? Or rethinking, are you seeing any of those inklings? Is it real? Am I imagining it completely? And B, what would your advice be?
I don't think so, because, well, first of all, on the one hand, yeah, I've been getting some, like the group 100K and 10 that I worked with a year ago. So as I said, they're sunsetting their organization, and they got so many requests for the method that they used to help with it. They have created this thing called the Starfish Institute, starfish being the keystone species in tide pools, to help other organizations do that regardless of the problem. And we've worked on now a couple from teenage mental health and suicide rates to like the lack of women leaders in nonprofits. That said, Rich and I also work for a company that works in COVID testing and environmental testing of COVID, of finding COVID on surfaces, to use that as like a way of pooled testing a whole space to see whether anybody is shedding, and you can pick it up on the surfaces. And the degree to which people don't understand how that could be useful, and the difficulty we've had just trying to have schools use it to be able to indirectly test whole classrooms of students with just a few tests in the classroom to see if anybody's shedding, and the degree to which they're still stuck on like hygiene theater of like just cleaning and bleaching everything, thinking that's going to make a difference, even though with the sun we know now that most transmission is people to people through the air. The degree of time it's taken for people to even understand that, like in the customers that we're working with, does not give me hope that, like, when we see, wow, COVID is such an example of how relationships matter, like interdependencies matter, and like everything is about the complexities of it, that if you shut down business, people stay at home and then businesses get slammed, or if you like shut down schools, kids show up in the ER with skull fractures because they're getting abused at home, or whatever it is, like all these interdependencies, like I don't think, like my gut sense is that we live in a bubble, and that we and our colleagues see that, but that a lot of people don't. So, yeah.
Well, my hope and my ongoing, again, naive optimistic hope is that by starting to have some common language in the research and applied community, and starting to put some of this language up front and in the proposal language is a way to build comfort with the funders over time, right? To start to build in and be overt about some of the things the two of you use intuitively after 20 odd years of working with each other, but say it out loud from the beginning of these methodologies. And that's the hope of this broader community, that we constellate around an evolving best practices tool. I keep saying toolkit, but that's the idea of what did we learn from ecologists? What have we learned from how diplomacy is managed, right, and studied versus, and to make, but building that into the language of proposals, getting that in all corners. And it starts to be, oh, right.
The question that was like, I think that's awesome. And I really applaud you for that. I think a challenge is, what I've seen is going from academic research to like public understanding and lived realities, because so much of what, some of the stuff that I'm doing now with this, like, problem mapping work, it was like 2007 when we were working on it. It was 13 years ago, and published it in 2009, and then even give a talk on the TED stage about it in 2010. And it's been a decade since then that I'm just getting like people understanding it and getting inquiries to actually do it and do it in the real world and people getting it, So I just find it really interesting how long it takes for what seems like a really, like if it's a new drug discovery, boom, there's money to be made, it gets out there pretty quickly. But if it's like a new approach to solving problems, I feel like I don't know how to make it filter faster into the business world or the nonprofit world, even in philanthropy, or where they're trying to do that. It's taken the work I'm doing now in philanthropy. I tried a decade ago. It's been a decade of trying to propose this, and yet they just had like they had their own way of doing things, and it was really hard to change stuff.
Well, that's why we're here. That's exactly why we're here, right? We're here to give more transparency and a meeting place to share ways to do exactly this, right? I feel like there's a thought bubble over your head, Rich.
Yeah, it's just interesting what Eric is talking about. It's just like, it feels like we know so much more than what is, what we know versus what is applied in the world is so different. And the area that, to me, where it's just so glaringly obvious, of course, is the whole climate problem.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, decades and decades of knowing exactly what's going on, and we're seeing it happen.
But okay, so my challenge to you is there a critical thinking, is there an updated critical thinking course for the think tank and academia set that would refresh, right? It feels like facts are one thing, and process and culture within teams and research organizations is a very different one too, right? Again,
so I think in that sense there could be, there could be more of that sort of, more of the reconstruct, there's the deconstruction of typical reductionist thinking, and then there's the reconstruction to put the systems back together, and there could be more, I think, more attention paid to that in academia. But I think what Eric was addressing is the fact that we already live in a bubble where where what we know now isn't even close to being used and close to being accounted for in daily life and in public policy. And so if we go even deeper and develop even more sophisticated ways of looking at the world and more sophisticated models of the world, is that what we should be doing, or should we be working more at that interface to try and get what we know now adequately addressed? Yeah, I really don't know what the answer to that is.
It said, I don't know the limit is understanding. The limit is like, there's a lot of perverse incentives out there. And so, I mean, we experienced this in our environment data in our startup, was that it's not enough to have a profitable business that, could make more money than it spends and be profitable. Investors want obscene profit. Like they don't never say, oh, if you just made that much profit, that'd be fine. Instead, they want to know what's the most you could possibly make in the shortest amount of time. And if you don't have a plan for that, you won't get funding. And so what that does, like a really good example is the field we were in, which was data science and data discovery, was like, there were markets we could go after that we could have made money, more money than we spent, to help solve complex problems. But in that field, there's an adjacent market where you could make a lot of money working with hedge funds, working, market research, working in advertising. So if you went to an investor and said, we're explicitly not going to work with hedge funds, we're going to work with people trying to solve complex problems, they will laugh you out of the room, because you could make a lot more. And their goal is to make not profit, but as much profit as is humanly possible. And until there's a framework where people say, there's this much profit, Kickstarter is the same example. Perry Chen struggles with the fact that Kickstarter could make a lot more money if they just funded tech gadgets to no end, crowdfunding tech gadgets. But his mission is to support the arts. And he will say no to certain kinds of projects that would make more money in order to support their mission to fund the arts. And he can't get investors interested because he could make more money than they are.
Right.
But he's actively choosing not to, even though it's profitable. And so I feel like until that perverse incentive is tackled, then our understanding and sense making has limits,
I don't disagree.
And so much of that comes from our economic models, which are so fundamentally not system level models, where we have these things called externalities, and which is just one of the more mysterious concepts that I've ever run across, because it doesn't seem like, I'm not quite sure how you do that, how you think you can create a model where you just push some things off and call them externalities, and then within this smaller model you have one thing going on, but of course you're ignoring a vast amount of really important stuff.
But I feel like the folks who get poached out of academia and think tanks into the commercial sector, if some, again, back to your point earlier, how many people or how many of a need to adopt a practice for it to change everything? I'm going on the assumption that not everybody needs to embrace this way of thinking and working together, but enough folks, and I think it starts in the academia think tank tier, but prove me wrong, start to work together at least enough of the time in a different way that will then spread into government posts and becoming the funders, and right, it doesn't change if we don't change it.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's,
and I think, I saw a comment about alternative business models. I just feel like there has to be, demonstrated success of other business models that aren't profit maximizing, but more profit optimizing.
that's Shelley's point.
Or we have to change the current models to actually include the true costs of business, so that they actually don't look so good, because they're looking good is fake.
Right.
Totally. And that's why profit optimizing, to me is important, because it implies that you're like, trying to incorporate the cost as well.
Yeah.
So as we head toward wrapping up here, guys, first of all, thank you. This has been really great. Are there any things that any thoughts you had on this sort of big, unwieldy, fun topic that we didn't touch on at all, that are at least questions people should think about, or things you'd like to close out with? Yes.
You know, one quick question I have is, or thing to think about is, to me, a lot of this revolves around evidence, you know, like how do we think about evidence and how do we know what we know? And I feel like there's the academic, you know, frontier, but there's also just in like education at the bottom, you know, as kids are growing up, just teaching kids how to think critically about evidence and how to evaluate evidence in light of data, and to think, have an ecological worldview, which means they understand multiple causality and diffuse causality and systems. I just feel like it's so critical. So it's just something to think about, you know, how to.
I wonder if
Yeah.
some of the fake news mitigation efforts underway from all kinds of folks might yield some useful reverse engineerable tools in that.
I hope so, yeah. And education is like not just how to tell fact from fiction, like which facts are true, but how to understand when a story that sounds good, that's based on fact, is actually not true, you know?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Rich, to close out?
Yeah, not really, except that I wholeheartedly, you're talking about creating change in these systems. Yeah, I think that going back earlier, creating change in the educational systems that feeds people into the systems is such an important piece of it, and education is just so neglected. And I think that's just is a hugely important area.
Well, guys, thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to all the Plexers listening along and feeding into the chat. We really appreciate it. And this will be posted on Polyplexus and probably on Polyplexus's YouTube channel, I presume, at some point. Anyway, thank you, guys.
Thanks so much. Great.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun.
Appreciate it.